Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the session of today of the New Voices talk series on Latin American women philosophers. Today, we'll have the presentation of Professor Teresa Rodriguez, who holds a master's and a PhD in philosophy from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Her research focuses on the history of women in philosophy, especially during the Renaissance and early modernity, including authors like Anne Conway, the historiography of Platonism, and issues related to methodology and the history of philosophy. And her presentation today will be on Laureana Wright and social romanticism in Mexico during the second half of the 19th century. Thanks so much for your acceptance and join us in this series, Teresa, and please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks everyone for being here. So I am going to share my presentation, and then I'm going to read my paper.
Yeah, perfect.
It's perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. Laureana Wright, a prominent Mexican writer and intellectual, was born in Tasco and raised in Mexico City. Her essays, The Emancipation of Women Through Study and Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means to Correct It, position her as a pioneering theorist of women's education in Mexico. Nevertheless, Wright's work reflects an ambivalent stance on women's roles, advocating both intellectual equality and traditional domestic responsibilities. In this paper, I will argue that Wright's ambivalent position in her essay, Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means to Correct It, is a direct result of the reception of French social romanticism theories about women, especially those of Eugène Pelletan. So this paper has the following sections. First, I will make a short introduction of Laureana Wright's biography. Then I will talk about social romanticism, especially that of Eugène Pelletan. And in the third place, I will examine this essay, Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means to Correct It. And finally, I'll make some. So as I was saying, Laureana Wright was born in Tasco, a small mining town in southern Mexico, but spent her childhood and adult life in Mexico City. Her mother was Eulalia Gonzalez and her father Santiago Wright, an American mine owner from a well-to-do family who promotes her education, as she herself narrates in this essay, Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means to Correct It. According to Alvarado, I quote, she received a careful private education basically made up of learning English and French and the first elements of education, end quote. According to Bolaño, Laureana's contemporary, around 1865, she wrote her first poems, marked by her patriotism, a trait that she retains in some of her other published poems. In January 1868, she married Sebastian Kleinhans, and Bolaños says that she abandoned her literary work for a year to dedicate herself to her husband and home. She had a daughter, Margarita, and she died in 1896 after a series of illness. Appreciated by the most recognized cultural and literary circles of the 19th century in Mexico, she was a member or honorary member of the societies Netzahualcoyotl, El Porvenir, Liceo Hidalgo, and Liceo Altamirano. This meant recognition as a writer in prose and verse, according to Bolaño. Her weekly Violetas del Anáhuac stands out among the publications of the time. It was directed by Wright and later by Matiana Murguía. According to Bolaño, I quote, Laureana is distinguished in her writings by her highly progressive and liberal ideas, by her daring features, and by her philosophical conclusions, qualities that, if in a man are praiseworthy, in a woman are sufficient title to magnify her. But Bolaño also affirms, the home is the heaven of good souls. From it, redeeming women emerge in the august forms of the mother or the teacher, to spread along their path either the precious streams of tenderness and love or the sublime teachings of morality and progress. Laureana is one of these priestesses. The home was her temple. End of quote. We have some news about her participation in the literary meetings of Liceo Hidalgo. For example, between 1874 and 1875, she lectured on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Among the periodicals in which she collaborates, we find El Monitor Republicano, El Bien Público, El Álbum de la Mujer, directed by Concepción Jimeno de Flaquer, Violetas de la Náhuac, El Diario del Hogar, and América Latina. Violetas de la Náhuac was first published in December 1887, but it was not until January 1888 that it appeared under this name. Before, it was titled Las Hijas de la Náhuac. It was a literary newspaper redactado por señoras, whose director and administrator was Ignacio Pujol, and which Laureana served as a literary director. According to Alvarado, despite the short duration of the latter, Violetas de la Náhuac, from December 1887 to June 1889, due to the nature of its contents, it represented an important advance over other publications of the same journal. It was also an excellent means for both its director and most of its collaborators, and even some readers, to express their ideas on various topics, among which educational issues stand in particular. Thus, through the pages of this weekly, this avant-garde women's group would try to inform and transform the women of their time. The weekly, and I quote Alvarado again, retained the ambivalent position of its predecessors, always fluctuating between preserving or transforming the female stereotype, but maintained a much more coherent and progressive editorial line than other related publications. Through its various articles, the weekly questioned the modus vivendi of Mexican women by proposing almost obsessively female education as the only vehicle for the desired transformation. End of quote. Some of its articles have philosophical contents, such as the series on materialism and idealism that ran from March to April 1888. This impetus for education is in line with two other essays by Wright, The Emancipation of Women Through Study and Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means to Correct It. The first, according to Alvarado, appeared in 1891 in Imprenta Nueva, and the second a year later. Laureana can be considered, based on these essays, as a theoretician of female education, according to Alvarado. The essays are, I quote, the first of their kind written by a Mexican woman. In them, she upholds equality and intellectual capacity between men and women, the ability of women to pursue any profession, and the right of women to practice them, although they also maintain the ambivalent stance of her weekly. In this paper, I present Laureana Wright not only as a journalist, poet, or literary figure, but as a thinker who advocates for gender equality by adhering, via Eugène Pelletan, to the complex theoretical framework of social romanticism. In this sense, she takes on certain philosophical commitments that enable her, on the other hand, to advocate for women's right to emancipation through education, but on the other, to assert that their primary mission, or their ultimate goal, is to be wives and mothers. This tension, as I will attempt to show, arises from that complex theoretical structure and is not an isolated outcome, but rather inherent in a broader moment. Secondly, It provides her with a lens through which to analyze the situation of Mexican women in the necessary advances to achieve their emancipation, always within the limits of their ultimate goal. And lastly, the theoretical framework enables her to confront those who oppose women's right to education and emancipation in Mexico, engaging in what we might call a Mexican querelle de femme. It follows her to demonstrate that her ideas are grounded in works widely recognized in France, although she sometimes radicalizes the position she receives. Within this framework, I will analyze her reception of Peloton in the essay on the erroneous education of women and the means to correct it. In this essay, Wright extensively quotes Peloton on 6 occasions and refers to him on 2 others. These quotes allow her to textually reinforce the 3 aspects mentioned above, namely incorporation into the theoretical situation of Mexican women and ultimate defense against attacks on her position by conservative writers. So now I'm going to go to the second section, social romanticism. Within the theoretical framework of social romanticism, according to Mitzman and Crossley, we find the following concerns. The semi-religious quest for harmony in social existence, in nature and in the cosmos, efforts to integrate the common people, women, workers, peasants into society, politics, religion, and history, advocacy for liberty and human rights and equality between men and women, the rehabilitation of women as the key to the regeneration of human society, the glorification of the mother through the idea of the mission of women in moral transformation, and faith in the progress of humanity through science and technology. These principles were the work of ex-Saint-Simonians like Leroux and Renan, of Christian socialists like Lamennais, of popular romantic novelists such as George Sand, Victor Hugo, and Eugène Sue, of left liberal men of letters like Michelet, Quinet, and the popular poet Béranger. Peloton is part of this group, close to Lamartine and Sand, admired by Jean Zola. His writings enjoyed great popularity, and he was also a skilled politician. Georges Turut, in his work Du Républicain de Progrès, provides a detailed account of the life and work of Eugène Peloton, based on the studies of Edouard Petit from 1913. Born on October 29, 1813, into a Protestant and Masonic family near Royan, Peloton grew up in a politically influential environment, as his father and grandfathers were notaries, and his father served as the mayor of Royan during the turbulent period of the Restoration. At the age of 20, Peloton moved to Paris, where he began his literary career by publishing articles in the Minerva magazine. His talent and connections led him to form relationships with literary figures of the time, such as Edgar Quinet, Victor Hugo, Michelet, and especially Lamartine, who became his close friend and godfather to his first daughter. He also had a brief relationship with George Sand, who invited him to tutor her son. Peloton married twice. His first wife died young, leaving him widowed with a daughter. He later married Virginie Marguerite Gourlier, a painter, with whom he had 4 children, including Camille Peloton, who also pursued a career in politics and writing. Throughout his life, Peloton wrote numerous literary and journalistic works. According to Turut, his style was considered by some to be verbose and redundant. But his writings tackled profound issues and resonated with the concerns of his time. Among his most notable works are La Lampe éteinte, a romantic novel, and Les droits de l'homme, where he articulated his political thought, advocating for the separation of church and state, freedom of worship, the abolition of the death penalty, and slavery. In 1863, Pelletan began to actively engage in politics, elections, and participating in various conferences on topics such as women's rights and the figure of Lamartine. His work, La Mère, La Madre, the Mother, of 1865, is a 27-part study on the history of women's condition, and was highly admired by figures like Émile Zola, and advocated for women's right to education, work, and citizenship. Towards the end of his life, Pelletan continued writing, publishing correspondence, and reaffirming his belief in a living God and in human progress. He defended the idea of an ideal republic and was a fervent advocate for the liberty and human rights until his death. The Mother was deeply influenced by social romanticism, a current that is characterized, as we have seen, by considering the equality between the two sexes, that the equality between the two sexes must be complete. However, this goes hand in hand with the conception of the role of women as redeemers of humanity through their emotional inclination. Pelletan continues with this consideration. He pays a great deal of attention to the destiny of women following the trends of his time. But there is, as Crossley affirms, a contradiction in his position. I quote, the message that the Mother gives is therefore muddled and contradictory. On the one hand, Pelletan seems to encourage women to emancipate themselves. Quote, "O women, whoever you are, in whatever rank fate has placed you, make your own self." On the other hand, he takes up the old notion of the complementarity between man and woman, to each their own sphere of influence. While women are equal to men, they are primarily destined to take care of their home and family. Education is necessary to ensure success in these areas, not only for women, but also for their husbands and children, in addition to preserving them from misery in case they become widowed or are abandoned by their spouses. Pelletan feminism, according to Paul Basquiat, is a moderate and traditional one. Judith Stone, for her part, highlights that Pelletan's feminism is marked by numerous contradictions. The Mother was a crucial reference in Wright's essence on the erroneous education of women and the means to correct it. She returns to that contradiction between national inclination and emancipation through education that she seems to inherit from social romanticism. The essay is divided into 22 chapters in which Wright presents several models of women, like Pelletan in his work The Mother, published in France in 1866 and translated into Spanish in 1875 by Mariano Blanch in Barcelona. In the first chapter, entitled Contemporary Women, she recounts the advances that the 19th century has given to women, but states that the only way to achieve true equality with men is through education, to which women are entitled, a right that must be enforced. The accusations against women as incapable of enlightenment are due not to their intellectual nature, but to vices in their education that Wright described in the following 12 chapters, where she presents a series of short stories which reproduce the procedures followed by Pelletan in his book, where she presents women as unhappy due to an absence of deficient education. The ignorant, indolent, inexperienced, fanatical, indulgent, presumptuous, frivolous, flirtatious, or timorous women is opposed to the enlightened woman, the housewife, the dignified woman, the wife, the mother, the artist, craftswoman, the scientist, and the perfect woman. This essay closes with 2 chapters dedicated to reading and books, which are key to women's emancipation. Wright believed that women's emancipation was intrinsically linked to their role in society. While she endorsed the idea that women could and should be equal to men intellectually, she also maintained that education was crucial for them to fulfill their traditional roles as caretakers of the home and family. This education, according to Wright, would not only ensure their success in these roles, but also protect them from the situation in the event of widowhood or abandonment, as Pelletan also sustained. In the chapter The Melancholy Woman, Wright delves into the tension between nature and education, and theme inherited from social romanticism. She asserted that there were no anatomical differences that justified the intellectual inferiority of women as compared to men. Pelletan had not denied that differences exist. Wright, however, also believed that women possess certain innate qualities, such as subtlety, perseverance, and self-denial, that predispose them to emotional and passionate extremes. Wright expressed hope that once women were liberated from ignorance through proper education, they would channel these qualities towards beneficial ends. Wright cites Pelletan 6 times to support her theoretical assumptions about women, briefly presented above. Incorporation into a theoretical framework, reflection on the situation of Mexican women, and ultimately defense against attacks on her position by conservative writers. Atwood would beautifully exemplify each of these points with 3 of the 6 quotes, or maybe just 2 because I think I'm running out of time. In the early chapters of her essay, she presents types of women marked by ignorance. Later, she shifts to examine those types who, while not entirely uneducated, have limited and insufficient education. These types, according to Wright, are the most common and widespread among women of her day. They do not arise from a complete lack of education. Rather, they are the logical outcome of an incomplete, superficial, and limited education. Wright considers this sort of education as, I quote, a significant concession from our enlightened and reformative era, which began to feel embarrassed by past backwardness and try to correct the injustice of previous generations, end of quote. Pelletan is quoted as describing this semi-education in the following paragraph. As you can see, it's a long quote, and I'm just going to read the part highlighted. As for the rest of the instruction, it is no more than an appetizer placed on the table of the future to ease the conscience. The young woman is allowed to learn some grammar, history, languages, but only as a formula in a haste, so that when the young woman leaves the school or the convent, she knows with little difference how to spell and recite the Pythagorean table. This system of education is not for the young woman to begin marriage. As you can see, Pelletan opposes this kind of education, and Wright affirms her adherence to the theoretical framework that views women's education as a means for their emancipation, agreeing with Pelletan that a flawed education, that the one presented in this quote, is almost as harmful as complete ignorance. It produces vain and frivolous women who harm their families, societies, and themselves. Wright refers to Pelletan as a wise French writer. She contextualizes Pelletan's word in the Mexican setting, meaning what in France is described as a false education, in Mexico is considered the maximum education of women. The woman who, by reputation as exception, knows at least spelling, some music, and watercolor painting without a smattering of history, science, or philosophy, is considered a notability, and it is said that she has a brilliant education, according to Wright. Wright continued the treatment of the implication of false education through the second quote from Pelletan that I'm not going to present here. In the third quote, Wright moves from the inadequate education of young women before marriage to the role of women as wives. According to Wright, for a woman to be truly a wife and not just a companion or domestic servant of a man, it is necessary for her to rise to the same level of knowledge as her intellectual debates and to be an active entity in the administration of common affairs. Here again, Pelletan is described as, I quote, the eminent Pelletan, whom I consider one of the writers who have judged women with the most impartial and liberalism, end of quote. In the fourth quote, the mother is the subject of analysis. For Wright, the mother should concern herself not only with the physical well-being of her children, as other species do, but also with their intellectual and spiritual well-being. And those who neglect the second aspect are halfway mothers. Here, Pelletan is once again the reference. The fifth quote also appears in the same chapter on women as mother. So it's the second quote that we're going to review in this paper, but it's the fifth in the essay. Here, Wright declares that it is an important social issue, the question of mothers, and uses Pelletan to emphasize that his desire for women's education is not a personal delusion or utopian idea, but one shared by free minds and serene hearts who think and feel the same in even more categorical terms, i.e., those thinkers close to social romanticism. The example presented is again a quote from Pelletan's work La Mer. Here, Pelletan outlines a curriculum for women, which I assume Laureana supports through the codes, the quote. And here it's interesting to note how Pelletan recommends philosophy for women. I'm just going to read this section here. Philosophy, I know, is only for women a privilege or a license to be ridiculed. Yet, look at the contradiction. It is expected that women practice a religion, and without it, no man in our society today would be bold enough to ask her hand in marriage. And what does religion talk to us about? About God, the universe, the soul, immortality. All topics of metaphysics, and the most profound metaphysics at that. Women must study and understand all of this if they do not wish to be anatomized. But if by chance they sneak a glance into the domain of philosophy, they are politely sent back to their shores and might even be accused of a lack of intellectual restraint. Well, it's also a long quote. I'm just going to leave it in the screen for a while, and I'm going to continue reading. Wright aligns herself with the arguments presented by Pelletan regarding women's education, but attempts to take them further. In her view, women, if they wish to fully carry out the important role of promoting goodness, must gain a deep understanding of evil to guide their children away from it. They need to study vice to clearly define the path to virtue, and like a skilled and wise physician must know all poisons, the mother must know all evils to establish the moral therapeutics of the family. Right then, back to discussing the situation in Mexico, where she finds no examples of mothers who educate their children practically for life, rather than following an innocent-based education model. Laureana Wright notes with sadness that the professional and scientific education of women in Mexico is far from being accepted, and those who pursue it are ridiculed. She links this to what happens in Spain, from whom Mexico inherits the same tendency, in contrast with other truly cultured nations. I quote, where consciousness thinkers and profound philosophers have proclaimed and continue to proclaim as the first basis of their social greatness a free woman, a woman equal to man, a rehabilitated woman, a citizen woman. The reference to the citizen woman once again draws from Pelletan's book. Mexican women can work as primary school teachers, or only as primary school teachers. Only Matilde Montoya has dared, I quote, to pursue her determination to the point of earning the title of medical surgeon. Regarding this, the support again comes from Peloton texts. When addressing the point we are discussing, Peloton says, and this is the last quote, in this case, what becomes of the argument based on the weakness of women to keep them in the domestic regime of the household? If she is weak, surely the first thing to give out will be her body, and yet industry demands the same work from that body as it does from her husband's. And if it's demanded that a woman be granted the right to take up an occupation, in particular a profession that depends more on intelligence than on monopoly, and decree that women lack the ability to practice any profession. But there is a philosopher to whom these concerns matter little. That philosopher is progress. It is natural for the merchant to try to reduce office expenses. First, he pays an employee to keep his books and serve his clients, but upon reflection, he soon realizes that in his wife he has an economical employee and installs her to keep the cash book. Progress for progress, the woman proves in the office that she has the required ability to add up a sum, and immediately the law grants her the right to trade, to open a shop, to run a bank, and even to argue in court. Since women are allowed to take a place in commerce and engage in speculation, that is to prove their intelligence. Why deny them the opportunity to extend the sphere of their activity? Outside the commercial activity, is there not a single other profession that they might undertake? Would they not be suitable for medicine? But is it appropriate to ask a young woman to take a course in anatomy on a dissecting table and learn what she will never know too late, the miseries of the human body? And why not? You have no objection to a young woman obtaining a diploma as a midwife and thus penetrating the secrets of our organism. For this, what reason do you invoke? Modesty? For the same reason, you might admit that women are the ones who should care for other women. But this is a repugnant task that will agitate the nerves of the third sex. Why then do you assign the care and healing of the sick who groan in hospitals to the sister of charity? Who does not recognize, on the contrary, that women possess to a greater degree than men the courage of self-sacrifice, of suffering, and that they are more delicate in placing a handful of lint on a wound? Wright asserts that women are just as capable as men and have the right to pursue any profession men do. She believes that women's intellectual abilities are equal to men's, even if some doctors argue that women's brain is smaller. Wright stands by her belief in woman potential, despite contradicting a respected compatriot writer who once, while reading a poem by a female author, declared, "We do not believe in woman." I quote this author. "She may possess great talent, imagination, and education, but she will seldom reach the highest levels of knowledge and genius." End of quote. Wright, however, insists that the heights of intelligence are accessible to all humans, and women, if given the same opportunities, can achieve the same intellectual heights as men. Here, Wright refers to Mateos, cited by Juan de Dios Pesa. Wright confronts those who ridicule her efforts as a proponent of Mexican women's education through a series of arguments from within social romanticism. And to conclude, we have seen that Wright adheres to Peloton's notion of progress, citing him multiple times to support her ideas and show that they are not merely her own invention, but rather supported by a sophisticated theoretical framework that argues this principle with strength and adequacy. On the other hand, she adapts Peloton's ideas to her own context, highlighting the plea of Mexican women in the face of education and a society that limits their intellectual possibilities, while simultaneously demanding they fulfill they fulfill the role of educators and pillars of their families. The ambiguous position we encountered at the beginning is also not merely her own invention, but is part of the same theoretical framework, as we have seen in the case of Peloton and social romanticism, that her feminism has a conservative bent in the sense that it assumes women are the redeemers of society, and that their education should be, on the one hand, equal to that of men, but on the other hand, aligned with their roles as wives and mothers, is consistent with the framework she adheres to. However, there are several points where Wright goes beyond this movement. On the one hand, her analysis of the situation in Mexico is characteristic of her commitment to Mexican women specifically. On the other hand, she argues that there are no anatomical differences that justify educational distinctions. Lastly, she is engaged in a Mexican querelle de femme in the Mexican context, combating figures like Alvarez through the same theoretical framework of social romanticism. Despite the ambivalence in her views, balancing between advocating for intellectual equality and adhering to traditional domestic roles proper to social romanticism, Wright's call for women's education and the right to pursue any profession was a bold and revolutionary stance within the conservative social framework of 19th century Mexico. Her work laid important groundwork for the later feminist movements in the country. Thank you very much.